Hey guys, I hope everybody had a good weekend. I hope you're staying home and staying safe. Um, I hope also that you guys are looking at your emails and that you are taking your quizzes on time. The quizzes deadline are Fridays at midnight, so make sure you don't wait until last minute to take them. I've had some students who've had some issues with the quizzes. As soon as you have an issue, please let me know. Sometimes I'm able to fix things from my end, and if I can, I will definitely do so. Another information I sent during the week was extra credit. I really do think you guys, some of you need the extra credit. I know that unfortunately it's not available on Netflix, the Civilizations documentary series. However, you can find it on the PBS All Access website. So it should only be $5, and it's actually a really good series to watch alongside with this art history PowerPoint that I've been showing you. Another thing I wanted to kind of remind everybody is that the way I teach art history is it's in a very broad way. It's in a very simplistic way. I am not going into too many details, and my main goal is to show you guys the connections between different things and how it connects through art history and eventually to our contemporary times. That is my goal. So as I'm discussing some of these issues, you'll see that I'm pretty broad or pretty generalistic, or I make very generalized comments, and that is with a purpose. I don't want to go too much into details. Anyways, without anything else, let me go ahead and get started with this next PowerPoint. So the last thing we looked at was Egyptian history or Egyptian art history, and we were looking at some of the more generalized elements of Egyptian art. And one of the things to keep in mind is that they wanted to show strength, they wanted to be clear, and did not want it to be ambiguous. Whatever you saw was the information they wanted you to know. There was nothing else there other than what you see. Now we're going to move forward, and one of the things that you've seen before already is this connection or this interaction between cultures. So we've seen a little bit of that interaction between Mesopotamia and Egypt, and now we're going to continue to see it as we go into Greece. So here we go. We're going to start talking about the first step out. So here's Egypt. And as we go into Greece, some of the information goes across the Mediterranean Sea. One of the cultures that you will see within the art history or within art history content is going to be the Minoans, which is Crete. And this is the time that we call the Archaic period in Greece. And it starts at about 700 BCE. But prior to that, as you notice, there were already cultures there. Now we show this specific time because this is the most iconic element or period of the archaic period. So let me show you some examples regarding art, specifically paintings. So here's Crete, and this is some of the elements you're going to see. Now here you will see some references to other cultures within the Middle East. They're not very specific, some that we haven't mentioned, but especially if you watch the TV series, you will get a lot more information regarding Crete as a culture and how it relates to the rest of Europe and the Middle East. Some of the elements you see here are going to be some of the dexterity regarding physical prowess from these cultures, as well as some of the elements regarding symbology, like the bull. Now, as we continue to move forward or towards Greece, the main continent, we're gonna see another culture called the Mycenaeans. So the Mycenaeans are going to be much closer to Greece and the Greece that we know. And here's where we're going to see the ceramics you guys are pretty familiar with. This is kind of the black and red type of ceramics that you'll see in a lot of museums, right? Like this one right here. You probably were familiar with it with like the Disney movie, Hercules. That's kind of how the movie starts, and it starts talking about the heroes. And here's when we start looking at how Greeks are starting to understand themselves in the context, on a much larger context. Here's where we start seeing the heroes as we know them within the kind of stereotypical Greek context, right? So we have Hercules, and we have all these other heroes like Achilles, but also um, the gods, starting to bring in the gods. And why are the gods coming to play at this point? Well, one of the things about the Greeks is that the Greeks wanted to understand themselves better individually, like a self-reflection. And for some reason, they couldn't understand feelings. They couldn't pinpoint or trying to figure out where the feelings come from and how is it that we were interacting. So what happens is the stories would be reflections of people's emotions, of people's cultures, etc., etc. So as we move forward, we finally get into what we actually know. Oh, sorry. Before we go into the main area of Greece, we're going to look at sculpture. So here's a Greek sculpture. Now this is from, once again, the archaic period. This is from the beginnings. This is when you can see the influence of other cultures. Now when you're looking at this specific sculpture, you're probably thinking, well, this is very similar to a different sculpture we saw before, right? And you'll probably be right. So here's the other one that you had in mind. This is the Egyptian sculpture that we just saw a minute ago. Now, there's a lot of similarities, and if we were in class, I would ask you guys to kind of point out different similarities. And a lot of times when students are participating, one of the first things they see is going to be the posture. The posture meaning, you know, the way that they're standing. So you'll see that step forward, you're going to see a very straight-backed individual. The other thing that people notice is going to be how well built they are, you know, like as if they were as if they've been going to a gym. Also the fact that we have males. What else? And then we can see that the posture as well of the arms, etc. All of those things are very similar. Also the fact they're made out of stone, they're carved. Now that's as far as the similarities goes. So what are the difference? What are the things that we see different between these two sculptures? What are the things where they start diverting from one another? Especially when the Greeks are trying to understand themselves culturally as an individual culture, you know, different from the Egyptian culture. So in the Egyptian culture, we talked about strength, and we talked all the elements regarding to strength, right? Here, what are some of the things that you see that are different from the Egyptian? So one of the things that is the most obvious is the fact that this sculpture is nude, right? So this one has some elements, some clothing, some vesture. So we have this cloth, this loincloth of sorts, and then we have the regalia that shows this to be a pharaoh, while this individual doesn't have anything. Now you may be thinking, well, this is kind of hat, and unfortunately that's not a hat. That is just the way that they sculpted hair, especially from the Greek period. Their hair is very coarse, so it looked like little tiny curls. So that's how they sculpted it. What other things are different? Well, one of the other things that is different is going to be the fact that this is an older gentleman and this is a much younger individual, probably a teenager. There's two reasons that we can see that. One would be kind of the simplified kind of male figure here, but also the fact that he's by himself could be another element that, you know, could be considered part of being a young individual. Now that's not always the case, but this could be a possibility for just looking at these two sculptures. Now the last thing I wanted to point out is going to be their faces. Now the faces is where you're going to see the most striking difference. And this is where the two cultures really are different from one another. Even though there's a lot of similarities, this is where they're very different. Now, while Egyptian cultures are looking at naturalistic representations and idealized representations, right? Meaning you want to recognize, you don't want to be ambiguous. You want to recognize that it's one, a human being, and two, that specific person. Now, for the Greeks, that's a different thing. For the Greeks, they do want you to understand that is a human form, but in this case is idealized in a general manner, meaning we're not going to have here just a specific individual, but rather an idealized version of what a teenager person would be. So in other words, this is a combination of all the beautiful, the best, the most adequate elements that would make a teenager. I'm going to put them all together into one, making a completely idealized individual. Here, this is idealized, but this is abstractly idealized, meaning that we're taking the individual, right, and we're going to keep the individual as it was. So we're not going to change who he is, but we're going to abstractly make him better, meaning, as I mentioned before in the previous PowerPoint, wrinkles, in good shape, and so forth and so on. So that is the difference. While Greeks were about the individual and idealizing the individual and being clear on who this person was, Greeks didn't really care so much for that individuality, but rather the representation of the best a Greek could be. And that's our completely two different ways in the approach of aesthetics as well as culture. And the reason why that's important to point out and to showcase is because when we go into main Greece, when we go into the classic period of Greece, the person that really clarifies kind of this approach to beauty and to perfection and so forth and so on is going to be somebody we already talked about in class at the beginning of the semester, and that is Plato. Plato is the one person in Greece that really sits down and thinks about what is it about the idealization and why is it so important to make sure that we are seeking the best or trying to find beauty and what beauty means and how we can approach it. And he's the one, as you remember, that talked about the truth. And the truth being this accumulation or grouping of idealized ways of one single object by a whole group. So if you remember our chair exercise at the beginning of the semester, that's what he meant. So if you think about that chair exercise as well as this sculpture right here, right, we start seeing those elements, like a whole bunch of different ideas of what the best teenager person is, and then combine into one single sculpture. So one of the things that Plato was looking at were rational simplicity, order, and restrained emotions. Those were key elements to beauty and to this concept of perfection of some sorts. So rational simplicity, meaning looking at things from my perspective of logic, from my perspective of clear understanding, as also as well, clear understanding is probably the best way to explain it, but even this kind of thought process follows culture all the way up to today. A lot of times when we're talking about really hard concepts and we explain something, one of our last questions that we normally ask is, does this make sense? And that comes from this idea of rational simplicity. Or when you're editing a document, you want it to be as clear as possible, as concise as possible, getting your point across. That is part of this idea of rational simplicity. The next part is going to be order. Order is very important in which you solve problems, in which you see things. Order is very, very important. So you're going to start seeing Greek society organizing their cities, they're organizing their culture, organizing their gods. Everything has an order. And last but not least, this is a very important one, and one that we talked about in the past, is this idea of restrained emotions. And why restrained emotions? There's two reasons. One is that when a person is under the effects of an emotion, they're not able to think rationally. It doesn't matter whether the emotion is happiness, whether the emotion is love, whether the emotion is anger. Any of those emotions, a person cannot think rationally. So when you constrain your emotions, when you restrain them, then you're able to think much more logically and therefore more rational and in a much better way. So I've made this comment in the past, but if you're a Star Trek follower, the concept of the Vulcans is very much following this idea of Greeks, and specifically the classic period, the Platonic Greece. What about the restrained emotions? Oh, the other thing about restrained emotions. The other thing about restrained emotions is that the way that the Greeks understood emotions was tied to the gods. So if you think about the gods would be somewhere in heaven, kind of like a puppetry show, and they would pull the strings on the person. So they would pull your anger strings on your love strings or whatever other emotion there would be. So that was the way that Greeks understood emotions. As I mentioned earlier when we were looking at that vase, that's how they were trying to make sense of why is it that people would do things like kill each other, or in regards to anger or envy or things like that, things that they couldn't control, or in some ways couldn't control. So those powers get given to the gods. So if you restrain your emotions in some ways, you're trying to keep the gods from manipulating you. So that was the other very important thing about restraining emotions. So with all those things in mind, and the fact that art or the reproduction of artistic or aesthetic elements was something that was frowned upon because it was not the truth, then those elements that were constructed in regards to representations of nature artistically, they were trying to be as close to the truth as possible, as close to that idealized version of whatever it was every single time. Trying in some ways to achieve the impossible, if I may, or to kind of contradict Plato, that you could actually get to beauty through the aesthetics or through carving or through whatever it was. So sculpture and a lot of the elements were very much naturalistic, meaning they could represent or replicate nature as you know it. Show the body alive, because what better way to show that that something is beautiful, the human body is beautiful, than when it's moving, right? Because otherwise it's dead, right? And last but not least, capability of movement. So here we go again. So this ability of trying to portray an object that's inanimate, to have the option or the concept that it could possibly be moving, or it has the sense of it being moving. As I had just mentioned before, idealization was very, very important, meaning creating the best of something in its most perfect way. Now, I don't use the word perfect too often because perfection is relevant, but if you were to think about everybody's idea of perfection and you put it all together and you get a Platonic idea or a truth, then that's the kind of idealization we're talking about. So idealization through mathematical calculations. Idealizations through objects without any blemishes, the most perfect it can be. Just like we talked about at the beginning of the semester, right? So if I say the word rose or flower, you're probably going to think of those flowers or that rose at its most perfect, in its most perfect element, right? No blemishes. It's not going to be tarnished. It's not going to have any of those things. And that's an idealization. And last but not least, which is tied also kind of to these blemishes, when we think of something that's idealized or something that is beautiful or truth, it's going to be also young. And we talked about that also as well at the beginning of the semester when we talked about beauty. Last but not least, in order to showcase this idea of the capability of movement or show that the body is alive, then the body in a really relaxed pose is going to help with this concept or this visual trick to show that the body is somewhat alive. So that trick is called contrapposto. And this is what contrapposto looks like, right? So we have here an idealized version of a spear bearer. This individual is not one specific individual. This is an idealized version of a spear bearer. So the body, everything that is in this sculpture is being completely idealized. So a combination of the perfection of what people thought a perfect body of a spear bearer would look like. And in order to give it a sense of even much closer to the truth, then you have it, give it the sense that it's moving, right? So we have this leg going backwards, right, and the body somewhat in a curved format, and the curved format is what we call contrapposto. All right. So as we get further into history, or as we go further into history, we will see that this idealization of objects, idealization, sorry guys, starts changing a little bit, and the change has to do because the Roman Empire is expanding. So we will see elements like this one, or sculptures like this one, which is the sculpture of a much more personalized individual. So we would recognize much more who the individual would be. However, everything else about it is going to be idealized. So we still have some of the Greek idealizations of the form or the figure, but we're going to have much more recognizable features of the individual who's being sculpted or created into an object. All right, here we go. Another element that we're going to talk about is going to be Greek architecture. Very, very important, because the same elements of idealization that we have seen on, you know, artistic objects, we're going to see them in architecture. Here's a very iconic building for the Greeks, and this is the Pantheon, the Acropolis, the Pantheon, the Parthenon. Sorry, the Parthenon. Sorry, not the Pantheon. The Pantheon is in Italy. The Parthenon is in Greece. So Greeks use the golden mean, which is the harmonious ratios that we even use today, and the golden mean is also part of the Fibonacci sequence, in which you have number 1, and then the addition of that element plus the next element equals the third element, and then the second and third element added together, and so forth and so on. It's the golden mean as well as the Fibonacci sequence. Another thing that the Greeks would use is a compensation for optical illusions. So when we as human beings look at the distance, when we see at nature, because of our own perception of nature, things are changed from its reality. So for example, if we look at a road, a straight road ahead of you, right, you will see that the two lines of the edge of the road will eventually converge in one single point in the distance. Now, is that the reality of that road? No, that is not the reality of the road. The road will continue on. So that is an optical illusion, right? So Greeks wanted to basically change the reality of the object, right? So that when we looked at it, it looked like it's supposed to look, not the way that we see it. In other words, they're changing it. They're changing the way that they build a building or an object in order to change the way we see it so it looks perfect. So a lot of times the lines are not straight. They actually move slightly inwards. So if we were to look at the columns and we were to draw straight lines up those columns, somewhere into space they will actually touch each other. Same thing with bulges. The columns will have a slightly larger bulge towards the top of the column. Why? Because when we see objects further high, they get smaller. So if they become thicker on top, they will look like they're even all the way through. And last but not least, if you're looking in the sideways to all the columns from the beginning to the end, because the last one, most likely the last one you won't be able to see because it is the last one. However, if you make it slightly thicker, then you even be able to see the very last column. So they were really altering reality so that when you looked at these objects, they look like the real thing and not the object of the optical illusion that we see. Now, another reason, before I go further with this, we will see this again in the Renaissance. And if you think about when we looked at, the Pietà, and we talked about how, Michelangelo changed the proportions of the Pietà so she looked as if she was able to hold the Christ and so forth and so on. Those ideas that he was using were exactly this ones. He was basically changing reality so that we could change the optical illusion of the object and we can believe in what we see. So give us an alternate reality so it's more real to us than the reality itself. I'm hoping that all of this makes sense, guys. Last but not least, you'll see that a lot of the architecture is going to be decorated with Greek culture and cultural elements. So a lot of stories, once again, the gods, the heroes, the battles, those kind of things are going to be portrayed all over the buildings. So the Battle of Lampith and Centaurs is the plinth that goes on, or that used to go on top of the Parthenon. Now, if you haven't been able to make it to Greece, and I hope you guys do sometime, so you actually go see the Parthenon. In the meantime, if you're not able to go to Greece, I strongly suggest you go up to Memphis. Is it Memphis? Yes, Memphis, Tennessee. No, this is not Memphis. Sorry, guys. Yeah, it is Memphis. Anyways, there is the replica of the Parthenon, and you're able to see exactly what the Parthenon looked like before it was destroyed. Now, the coolest thing about this Parthenon is that if you go inside the building, or when you go inside the building, there's a replica of what the Athena looked like when it was originally placed in Athens. So this building is a complete replica of the original. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it's not. It's actually located in Nashville. Okay, so it's in Nashville, Tennessee. All right, guys. So I hope you can make it there. It's really, really impactful. This thing is many, many stories high, so it's really neat. Now, on regards to architecture, we cannot move on without talking about the orders. Now, the orders are different kinds of columns that the Greeks used in order to identify buildings. There's three main orders. The very first one is what we call a Doric order. The Doric order of columns is very simple, geometric, and heavy. And this is what it looks like. And you've probably seen them around town quite a bit, right? The next kind of order and a different kind of building would have an ionic column. And this one would be taller, a little more slender, and slightly more decorative. Just like this one. There'll be the ones that have those kind of horn-looking things at the very, very top. And these ones are very recognizable. If you're around Fort Worth, you will see all three of the orders, but especially a lot of the Ionic ones. And last but not least, the most decorative of all of them is what we call a Corinthian order. And it's very complex. There's a lot of organic elements, a lot of plant-like things on the very, very top. And it's much more slender. So here's what a Corinthian column looks like. So Greeks would use all three different orders depending on the kind of building and the person will be located at. So theaters will have a specific kind of order, then political buildings will have a different kind of order, and so forth and so on. And that basically work as a way of labeling architecture. And actually, believe it or not, we still do it nowadays. We still have it around. Now, as time goes by and the classic period of Greece passes, the next period is what we call the Hellenistic period. Now, Hellenistic period basically means Greek-like. And it's Greek-like because Athens is slowly declining. The declination of Athens or Greek culture comes from comes with the expansion of the Roman Empire. So as Rome expands and the power of Rome expands, a lot of pressure is being put in Greek culture, and Greeks, in order to survive, are having to adapt to the Roman style of doing things. Now, Romans are not idealistic in the same way than Greeks are. Romans are much more about power and glory, and they're very much about history and the past, and being able to recognize the past. So, and we'll talk about Rome in just 1 minute. So one of the things that the Greeks are having to do, they're having to change the way that they depict imagery. And this depiction of imagery and in the context of Roman or Latin style of telling stories, is that the object, the storytelling, all of that's a little bit more over the top, meaning that there's a lot more emotion attached to the story, attached to the elements. So before, right, with the classic period of Greece, we didn't have many emotions. That was part of the Platonic idea. With the Hellenistic period, that's not the case. We're going to have a lot more emotion. It's going to be much more expressive. And because you want expression, you want to give it more excitement or more, emotion is the best possible wording here. Then you're going to have exaggerated movements that are going to be able to portray those emotions. At the same time, it's going to be less idealized. It's going to be much more a little bit over the top, so exaggerated. But also you're going to see a lot of elements that are much more naturalistic. So if a person is in battle, they're going to have scars and they're going to be deformed and things like that. Something that the Greeks probably wouldn't showcase, or would normally would normally just change altogether. So also everyday activities and historical subjects. And last but not least, portraiture. In portraiture, as I mentioned before, right, we're able to recognize who the individual is. And I had mentioned it earlier when we were talking about sculpture, how, in the main kind of high classic Greece, it was very idealized. Towards the end, it was not. And this is why, right? The change in this point, we can actually recognize the individual. In other words, we have portraiture. And here is what we're talking about. This is a Hellenistic style Greek sculpture. Now, this specific sculpture I'm showing you right now, it's a copy that was done by Romans of a Greek sculpture. Okay, the actual original one does not exist from Greece, but this is an original one from Rome, and this is Laocoon and his son. So here you can see the emotion, right? You can definitely see how much more movement there is and a sense of struggle that exists in this sculpture. Something that you definitely would not see in a classic period sculpture. So to show you all three of them, this is what we're talking about, right? So we have an idealized version, right? We have an idealized version that gives us a sense of the truth of a human being, meaning that's able to move, right? But once again, look at that, no emotions, right? It's constrained. It's not allowing the gods to take control over this individual. Here, it's completely different, right? So here, even though we have the same kind of context of idealization in some ways of the body, the aesthetics of the body and the perfection of the body and so forth and so on, we definitely have emotion. And the emotion is not so much because it is the gods, but rather because they're trying to tell a better story. And that has to do with the influence from Rome. So you can definitely see the evolution in these three elements. One of the coolest things in our history is you're going to see this evolution one more time in history, actually two more times in some ways, throughout art history. And now with this, it brings us to Rome. So as I was just mentioning, right, Rome slowly has been expanding. And 23 BCE, before the Common Era, is when Rome finally starts taking shape the way we recognize it stereotypically, right? The strong Rome, the powerful Rome. About 23 BCE is when Rome becomes the power it was. So one of the things to understand aesthetically about Rome is that Romans were practical. Okay, meaning they didn't have no problem on absorbing the information, gathering the things that they could, and then dismissing the rest. They were not into reinventing the wheel. And one of the cool things about Greece, and one of the things that saved Greek culture, was the fact that Rome admired Greeks. They really admired and collected everything that was Greek. So much so that even the Roman gods were basically borrowed from the Greeks and relabeled in order to be the new Roman gods. But from the way that they did the architecture, their cities, their art, everything was completely influenced by Greece. Now, when it came to Roman art, right, they were not into idealism. They were not into hiding the truth through any kinds of idealization. They were interested in this concept of power, and power came from history. So whether it was your lineage or whether it's your own battles and the things you won, all of that history was important to the Greeks. The story was very, very important to the Greeks. So instead of them being idealized, Roman architecture showed everything as it was, warts and all. A lot of those things that you can see with art history in regards to Rome is that Romans and Roman culture did a lot of death masks in order to remember the dead, in order to remember the grandfather or the great grandfather, and that is so that we can say this person did, this kind of heroic elements, or this person this kind of heroic elements as well, and and so forth and so on. So it was a way of remembering and create that lineage so you could absorb in some ways that power. Anyways, most of them were made out of wax. However, as they absorbed and expanded their culture into Greece, then they became out of marble, especially with Greek way of sculpting. And this is when we have this beautiful renditions of Roman sculpture. Right now, as you can see, this person has not been idealized. This person has been sculpted the way that it was, warts and all. Every single wrinkle, everything about the face, everything about the ears, everything in here was just exactly the way it was. Now, personally, one of the things I like to do, or I admire, or I keep in mind, I would say, when I'm in art history or art museum, and I'm going through different periods of art, right? One of the things I like about art in the Roman period is that when I look at a sculpture, I know I'm looking at exactly what that individual looked like. Now, they could have been a little bit altered, but the major reality is that what I'm seeing is what it was. Now, if I go back to Greece, not so much, right? Because they've been idealized. There's a lot of things that the sculpture is not showing me because they were idealizing the individual. Nothing wrong with that, but there's something about looking at the reality of what something really truly looked like in the past, and Roman sculpture definitely did that, well, as much as possible anyways. All right, here's another great example of the warts and all, so we know that's exactly what Augustus Caesar looked like. If you ever go to Vegas, which I don't, it's kind of it's love-hate relationship, and you go to Caesar Palace. Caesar Palace, this is the main sculpture that they have in Caesar Palace when you walk in. It's a bronze sculpture, this specific a replica of this specific sculpture, and it's pretty cool. The reason why I hate a little bit Caesar Palace in a way is because they take anything and everything that we stereotype as Roman and throw it together regardless of the period or regardless of where it was found or whatever. So there are sculptures there that are Greek, there are sculptures in that place that are Roman, and all kinds of different things all thrown together for a very stereotypical kind of concept, quote unquote, and I'm doing air quotes right now, of what Rome was like. So anyways, this is what Augustus Primo looked like. Now, as we continue on with Rome, one of the coolest things about Greece and Rome is that and even further down, and even if we go into Egyptians, is that they gave a lot of importance to this ability of thinking, this ability to create and to innovate, and they gave a lot of time and effort to thinking, especially the Greeks. The Greeks were very much into intellectuality. Now, Romans, since they absorbed a lot of the Greek ways of being, right? They also follow path with the same concept of really allowing the mind and those who are thinkers to think and to grow. So engineering was one of those elements and areas of Rome that really expanded, that allowed Rome to be architecturally one of the strongest empires that ever existed. Town planning allowed some of the Roman cities to be very, very large. Now, town planning also came from Plato and from Greece. And last but not least, architecture. So all of those elements were expanded from what the Greeks were doing. And they were expanded because the Romans, just like the Greeks, were very much about the intellect, knowledge. Now, when it comes to architecture, one of the things that is different from the Greeks is that architecture for Romans was utilitarian, meaning that the buildings were meant to be inhabited in some ways. So a much, much more true sense of architecture versus, sorry, I just went blank on the word. So anyways, pure architecture as utilitarian, an object that can be utilized as a place where you can inhabit. Some of them were also religious, but mainly, and a lot of them were also political. Now, one of the things that allowed them to get architecture to be as large and impressive as it was is the invention of the semicircular arch. This is an extremely important invention because it allowed to create spaces that were very large, interior spaces that were really large. So you would have interior spaces that had arcades with a lot of barrel vault ceilings and domes. Okay. So here's an example. Here's the arch, right? When you take an arch and you replicate it, then you have a barrel vault. And then the groin vault would be when you have different areas coming together. So this right here, this arch allowed for spaces to be much, much larger. If you have a plinth, meaning a flat surface here, once you put a lot of pressure in the center here and you have a flat surface, eventually that pressure will cave, right, the center. However, with the barrel vault or with an arch, when you put pressure here on this top point right there, the pressure actually, the push of the pressure goes to one side and then the other. So you're able to put a lot more weight on top of this arch than you would plinth. One of the most iconic buildings that was built using these archways was the Colosseum. Now, the Colosseum was also known as the Flavian Amphitheater. That's the original name of it. Emperor Flavian who created it, or who had it built. The foundation of that amazing structure is 44 feet deep. Most of them was built with brick, stone, and marble. It had 3 different stories. Each one of them was a series of colonnades that went all the way around the stadium or the Coliseum. Each one of the 3 different stories had all 3 different orders of columns. And I'm going to show you some of those pictures in a minute. I'm going to point them out to you. Now, these 3 stories we're talking about here are not the stories that we think of right now, right? They're going to be slightly different, and I'll show you that in a minute as well. Another thing is going to be the Coliseum was used for entertainment, something completely new. However, the entertainment there, as you guys know and stereotypically know, is that it's mainly for gladiators and for doing battles and recreating battles and so forth and so on. Now, because it is for entertainment, it had the ability to have up to 75,000 spectators. So that is right about as much people as a little bit more actually than the American Airlines Arena in Dallas. So here's what we're talking about. Right, so this is what it looked like if we're to take a slice of the building, and this is what it should have looked like when it was built. So this is story number 1, and as you can see, it's a very high 1 story. Excuse me. Story number 2 right here, right, and then the third one is going to be right here. This is also an area up on top. Each one of them made with colonnades. So here's a colonnade made out of arches that would go all the way around. So to give you an idea what that means, there you go. So you see all the way around the building for each one of those colonnades. Now this should look fairly familiar to you guys if you've ever been to a concert in Dallas or any Coliseum. They are actually basically built exactly the same way nowadays. There's not that much difference. And last but not least, I'm going to show you here, this is what it actually looks like nowadays. Half of the structure, unfortunately, from the outside has crumbled, and a lot of the interior also has gone away. But one of the things that I like to point out are the 3 Greek quarters, the Doric here, Doric, Ionic with the 2 little horns as I mentioned earlier, and the Corinthian, which is the very elaborate one right on top, right? So all 3 orders. And once again, just like the Greeks, each one of them was labeled for the specific kind of individuals or the areas where, for labeling a building, where different people can go or sit. As I mentioned before, another invention was the dome, and that just came from that same concept of the arch, right? The dome. And the largest open space in Europe for many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years was the Pantheon. The Pantheon is an amazing building in the middle of Italy, in the middle of Rome, sorry. And this building has a 20 feet thick walls, and most of it's created with concrete and masonry. The other very important architectural invention of the Romans was concrete. Concrete was extremely important as well. Okay, so that is the second most important invention of the Romans. Why? Because it allowed them to create very large structures, very sturdy structures as well. So anyways, the Pantheon was created concrete and masonry. And as I mentioned before, it had a dome. And this dome was 134 feet in diameter. Massive for that period of time. Now, in order to keep the weight away from the top of the sphere, let's put it that way, the weight diminished its thickness towards the top. And I'm about to show you an image in a minute now, and I'll point all those things out. But as it went up, it got thinner and thinner and thinner. Now, the way you built it was with coffers. And coffers are like big blocks of cement, but imagine them being carved out. So you had this really large, semi-square, kind of pyramidic looking um, blocks of concrete that were put side by side, one on top of the other until all of them were connected to make a complete dome. And last but not least, it was adorned with bronze stars. Now, nowadays, unfortunately, even though the Pantheon does exist and is one of the most well-preserved buildings in Europe from the Roman periods, unfortunately does not have the bronze stars. Now, the bronze still exists, but that is the doors for one of the Catholic churches in Italy, in Rome. So they took all the stars down to create the doors. Sorry about that, guys. My dogs are barking. The last thing I'm going to talk about for the Pantheon is going to be the oculus, or the eye. So on the very center, on the very, very top of the building, of the dome, there is a 30-foot opening on the very, very top. Now, this will allow for light to come in and also ventilation, but also rain and many of the other elements. So let me show you what this looked like. So here it is. So there's the Pantheon. Pantheon, yeah. So the Pantheon, here's the walls, 20-foot walls that I was talking about, right? Here's the height, the 134-foot diameter, right? And as you see, it gets thinner and thinner as it gets to the top. Now here's the oculus, the space. Now that's exactly what the floor looks like. That's the pattern of the floor. And this is what originally the plaza looked like. Nowadays, unfortunately, this whole area outside does not exist. The plaza still exists though, and so does most of the building. Here is a side cut of sliced view, sorry, of the Pantheon. Here you can see the Corinthian columns, the Greek Corinthian columns, right? So very much Greek up front. And here inside you can see these are the coffers. This is what I was talking about. You see how each one of them is cut out. And every single one of them gets smaller and smaller as it goes towards the top. Now inside of each one of these coffers is where the stars were held, right? Now if you think about it, right? If you had stars right here on this dome, what do you think that was for? What do you think it symbolized? If it's dome formed like this? The heavens, the sky, right? The sky at night with all the stars. Which brings me to say, or to question, what is the word Pantheon, Pantheon, sorry guys. Pantheon means. So what is the word Pantheon? What does that mean? So Pantheon is a word for the group of gods with a religion that is polytheistic. So the Romans have all kinds of different gods, right? So the Romans had Jupiter, and they had Mars, and they had Venus, and so forth and so on, right? Which were basically the same gods as the Greek gods, right? Zeus and Aphrodite, and so forth and so on. Anyways, and the reason why this place was called a Pantheon is because inside of each one of these spaces here, and on top, each one of them had a sculpture of a different god. So when you walked in here, you walk into this massive opening, right, with the stars on top, and then all the Roman gods around you. So that's what it's called the Pantheon, and it's the place where all the gods were at, and where you could pray or ask for anything from the gods. Right. Here's a beautiful picture, a painting from the Renaissance of the Pantheon. Right, there's the oculus, right, and all the coffers and so forth and so on. I believe you can see, no, you no longer can see the stars anyway at that point in period of time, right? But nevertheless, you can see where the sculptures were at. Another thing that's really interesting to see is the floor, right? I want you to really pay attention to the floor, because when I change this over, this is a picture of what it looks like right now, right? No change. So whenever you go to
go to Italy, this building has not changed basically in any way whatsoever since it was built in Roman periods. Everything inside is as it is right now as it was back then. The floor that you walk on is the same floor that Romans walked on, and many people of history have walked on. It's really an interesting place to be at if you understand the historical context of this place. Now, one of the reasons why it has been preserved so well is because this is actually a church. So when Rome became Catholic or Christian, the Roman Empire gave this building to the church. The church turned it into the Christian faith turned it into a church. And actually, in here you can come on Sundays, and there's mass on Sundays. Now, what you're probably thinking, well, what happens when it rains? Well, it's simple, it just gets wet inside here. Now, the cool thing about this place is that it has a draining system where the water actually flows right out of the building. Really impressive and really cool. So hopefully you guys will get to see it pretty soon whenever you go to Italy. Here's where it looks from the outside. So here's your Greek columns. Anytime you see Greek columns or a context to Greece in any way, right? This even looks like the Parthenon, right? Anytime you see that, think of the importance of knowledge or knowledge in general. Anytime you see it both in historical context and contemporary context, that's all about thought and knowledge. Think about universities, right? Or think about theaters. Places like that. Don't they all have this kind of Greek-like feel to them, right? And that is because we want to kind of bring back the importance or the connectivity to this idea of thought and how important thought is. So whenever you go to Italy and you're looking for this building, it's going to be really hard to find because it's hidden among these other buildings. So you just got to follow the map, and you continue to follow the map, and before you know it, you're in this opening, which is the plaza, and then at the end of the plaza, you'll see this beautiful, amazing building. All right, so let's look at painting. It's really hard to find painting in Greece because a lot of it, unfortunately, has peeled off. Fortunately for us, but unfortunately for those people from Pompeii and Herculaneum, is that Vesuvius exploded in 79 CE. So this volcano exploded and covered a whole 2 towns completely over. Now, by covering them, it basically preserved a whole bunch of buildings and a whole bunch of the cultural elements of Rome, or what Rome looked like in time. So here we go, there's Europe, Italy, and it's about where the location of Pompeii and Herculaneum is at. Now, some of the evidence, some of the things I want to show you is going to be this right here. So a couple things to point out, or several things to point out. One of them is going to be the Greeks, instead of painting a lot of times or putting large tile floors like we do nowadays, they used to do this kind of things. Right, so they would do mosaics on the floor, little tiny mosaics, and we'll talk about tessiare in the next PowerPoint. But anyway, so here is the mosaic on the floor, but then the murals, right? These paintings on the walls, which are very, very rare, because most of what we have for for Rome, is not painted in this way. Now, some of the things to point out about paintings and decorations inside buildings is that a lot of the imagery that you will see are going to be about luxury. Romans, as I mentioned before, were all about power. They were all about indulgence, all about politics. They were definitely kind of any way that they can portray themselves as better, they would use it. So showing of luxury and portraying luxury was part of the culture. Another thing that you will see is that you're going to have some elements of depth in the paintings, trying to showcase reality. in the paintings. And in those paintings, you're going to have a lot of landscapes, but most of the landscapes inside houses are going to be urban. Well, why urban? Well, because the best way to showcase power was how big and how powerful Roman living was. Roman cities, Roman architecture, that was a way of showing power. Um, it's different from us nowadays because we mainly live in cities, so our pictures that we have around our houses are about things that are about relaxing in the countryside. So it's slightly different. So let's look at one of those murals specifically. Let me show you where that one's from. You see that right here. That's right there. It's this one right there that I'm showing you. So this is great. So here we have a portrayal of civilization of Roman culture, right? So we have the city, and Romans are really good, and so is Greeks, about portraying reality and depth, right? So we talked about how we're able to create this illusion of space, this ability to create perspective, right? So when we look at perspective here, how many different ways can you see perspective? We can definitely see first simple perspective. So simple perspective like, objects that are one behind another, right? Staggered one behind another. So we know that this object here is in front of that one, and this one's in front of that one, and so forth and so on. So that's one way. Or another way of creating simple sense of depth is as objects go further towards the distance, they get smaller, just like this right here, right? So it gets smaller. So this one's much bigger, and this one's much smaller. Another way to show depth is going to be vertical placement. So the objects that are at the bottom tend to be closer to us than objects that are on the top. But all of those things are things we're already seen in a semester, and here pretty obvious. Now the other one that you guys can see is this attempt to do one-point perspective, right? So if you were to do one-point perspective, you know that you have a point in the distance, and then every single line would have to go through that one point. But if we were to have a point, let's say here, right? Let's say if we follow this line right here, right? Would all the other lines follow to that same point where the cursor is at? No, right? Because look at this ones. This will go down over here. Or look at this one. This one will be slightly off. And even this one right here, this one will go this way. So there's not really one point perspective. It seems like the Romans were so close to having one point perspective and truly understanding perspective in a two-dimensional plane, right? But they didn't. There was something that happened that this allowed them to really expand this knowledge of the three-dimensional, the illusion of three dimensions in the flat surface. Now, why is that important? Well, pretty simple, because mathematically, when you're able to do that, when you're able to have the lines going to one single point, you can actually triangulate, you can actually measure elements. And by doing the measurements, you can have a drawing, right, at a specific scale, and then replicate that in a different location. So let's say you have a machine, or let's say you have a building, or whatever else is three-dimensional. Well, you can actually create a fairly specific, fairly well mathematically done drawing, and then you can replicate that in reality. Now, what's important about that? Well, you can communicate ideas a lot easier. You can expand on your own ideas because they're drawn to scale. There's many different things, technologically speaking, that the ability to create three-dimensional, perspectively correct elements in a flat surface was very, very important. So what happened? What is it that at this point, this is the last time that the Romans were dealing with perspective, getting to the next level in technology? Well, we'll look at that on the next PowerPoint.